The stories contained in this podcast are the recollections of the guests we've invited onto the show. We are an outlet for people to share their truths, and we accept no legal responsibilities for the stories contained herein.
I'm Kendra Sheets.
And I'm Rich Gill.
And this is Enough, a podcast that aims to shine light into the darkened corners of the music industry while discussing the ways we can and should improve ourselves and, in turn, our community.
This podcast may contain graphic descriptions of sexual abuse and assault, including rape. These accounts can be triggering, especially for those who have also experienced sexual trauma.
If at any point during this podcast you feel yourself getting triggered, we suggest taking a break and taking care of yourself before continuing. But we do ask that you continue if you are able. These conversations can be mentally and emotionally taxing, but they are so important to have.
Welcome back to another episode of the Enough podcast. We are back from break. It is 2025. It is our first recording month of the year, which is actually February and not January, because we took a lovely break where we got nice and refreshed, hopefully, to do whatever we're going to do in 2025, this already very challenging year.
Yeah, we'll see what the rest of it looks like.
Anyway, we have a guest on today. We have Miss Ruby Blue. She is a Minneapolis-based musician. She is the frontwoman of Red Eye Ruby, and she is also an educator. If Ruby, you could tell us all about you, how you got into music, any backstory that we need to know before we dive into all things Ruby.
Yeah, so I'm a musician and I'm an educator, and it's awesome that we're here talking about this because there are some things that really led me into that in my teenage years and in my life that are relevant actually to the topic of this podcast. That aside for a second, I am a musician. I am a K-5 music teacher, and I'm super passionate about safe spaces and reducing harm and abuse in our music communities and in our larger communities in general. I say music community first because that is first and foremost, obviously, what I've experienced as a female musician. And it's also a place where I feel like there's the most need for this type of work right now in terms of rebuilding, I don't know, like the foundations of a scene that was built on the oppression and degradation of young women throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
You said it so well. I'm like drooling with what you just said.
It's so true though. It's like the foundations of this entire music industry are built on the backs of traumatized women. And it's, this sort of entitlement that we've dealt with for years and years. So when you look around the music scene, you don't see a lot of women like me. And there's some very good reasons for that, sadly. And it's not because, women aren't talented or that we don't have the correct type of brain to understand how to make music or whatever. It's because the scene is incredibly violent towards women. And I have experienced multiple levels of harm and abuse and violence, in the scene from members of the music scene. And it has really shape my ability to show up and be present in what I do. I am very, how do I put this? I'm pretty tough. I had some experiences when I was a teenager that were very, very difficult, but they also set me up to be incredibly resilient as an adult. And so because of that, I've been able to sort of exist in this kind of liminal space of being a woman in the music industry and dealing with microaggressions, or just straight up aggressions, all sorts of different things that I've experienced, not only from, collaborators, from guys and bands that I've dated, stuff like that. So yeah, I'm just really passionate about not only like teaching and educating kids about music and creating this spark and like creative collaboration, but I'm also really passionate about safe spaces because it's just like such an integral part of my story as an artist and as a woman.
The majority of people that we talk to, not all of them, but a high percentage, kind of come from the like punk hardcore scene. And you are totally outside of that.
When I was about 16, 17 years old, I started going to kind of hippie jam music festivals, right? With my boyfriend who was 18. So he always got me in or whatever. And so from a very young age, I was interacting with these, kind of hippie jam bands and stuff down in southern Minnesota. And that was honestly where I was the most inspired as a young person, in those spaces to go make music. But it was really confusing, being kind of a bright-eyed little lady, seeing all these musicians and then going, well, I want to do that too. And then I ended up like getting involved with some of the stages down there. And I ended up dating a guy that ran one of the stages. And I witnessed and experienced a level of violence towards women that was absolutely cataclysmic. And it was like kind of a big wake up call to realize that my dream of sort of being a female musician in this scene was not really actually real, because the women are treated in a way that makes it so that we cannot actually attain a level of success. It's really hard. When you look at those scenes, there's a lot of male and cis het males who are successful in the scene, and the women are either, or non-binary people or people of color. I mean, they're just either not really there, or they're there and they have to just normalize putting up with a lot of stuff. And, there's some women that I know, who have been able to like get into bands with dudes and, create strong connections with their bandmates and have kind of a buffer there. But for me, like as like a leading lady, if you will, like leading my own project, leading my own band, oftentimes I would go do solo stuff or do stuff on my own, and I would find myself in situations that I didn't really feel like anybody had my back. And I think there's a lot of women from that scene who also have similar stories to me. And some of those women do not make music anymore and do not perform because of the experiences that they've had. I continue on just because I'm just really passionate about it, and I just keep going because I don't really know what else to do. It's almost for me like just kind of moving forward sometimes in a space of spite or anger, because I feel like if I don't continue on and share my story and share my voice and share my music and share my truth, that other women are going to disappear too. So I've been very adamant about taking up space, even when it's really difficult. And there are a lot of women who throw in the towel because they're sick of dealing with the violence and the discrimination. And I get it. It's all valid.
Over the last, 6 to 8 years, non-binary people of the LGBTQIA community, women are now starting to kind of slowly move to the forefront. We had female fronted for a long time, where they're like, ooh, a female fronted band. Because no one says all 4 white, straight, annoying dudes singing about how much they hate women every single time there's one of those. But we have to like earmark the fact that there's a female in the band. And now that people that are looking more like us, that are sharing experiences like ours, are taking a forefront, are you seeing a large kind of following that doesn't look a lot like the following of the straight white guys?
Yeah, that's a great thing to consider. I think so. I also think that straight white guys love women-fronted bands as well. Like, we all love it. Like, I get a lot of male attention up there, and part of it is because they don't see a lot of people like me. There's not a lot of women getting up on stage, with the same sort of like vibe and feel that I'm getting up there with performing. And the reason for that is because many times when women go on stage and cultivate that same vibe and that same feel that I'm going for, a little bit sultry, little kind of coming up, a little bit of a femme fatale vibe, so often those women are, experiencing things in spaces that are so unsafe that they just stop doing it. Because of that, I do notice that there's kind of a niche, if you will. And I've ended up kind of filling a little bit of that niche. It doesn't mean that it's easy, but it does mean that people notice and they're like, oh, there is a kind of a benefit, I think, in some ways. Because it's like, for me, I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying there's a benefit for me because I'm able to come in and fill a space. Now, with that being said, I've been very passionate as I've filled that space and been able to recognize and understand the different conflicting things that can happen as a performer in that space. I've been really passionate about lifting up other women, lifting up young women performers so that, we can all do shows together or come together and, do some mentoring and do some coaching. Like, okay, like, this is what you want to not do, or like, don't talk to this person. Or if this person tries to pitch something to you that sounds like this, like, just be really careful. Banding together to encourage more women to take up that space is really important because people are hungry for it. And so they will follow and they will fall into it. But because of the social conditioning that we have as our culture, where, it's very normalized to treat women in sexy outfits, like, with disrespect, because, like, people literally said to me once, this guy said something to me, he's like, oh, so you want to wear a sexy outfit and be respected at the same time? That's ridiculous. That is such a prevalent attitude, especially in older white men. And I'm sure it's prevalent in lots of different demographics as well.
I would be like, so you want to come and talk to me with your bullshit attitude and be respected? Come on.
Yeah, but this is what female performers deal with and femme forward. A female, femme, right? Like, I definitely hold all of that, in the same kind of arena, if you will, because women who are coming up, who are trans or people coming up, they're non-binary that aren't necessarily black and white, one or the other, or women, anybody, or people of color, anybody who's not a cis white man in these spaces dealing with levels of microaggression and violence that white men just don't even see it. There, it's just like it's not even there.
Before we continue, give me your definition of microaggression. I think a lot of us do know where it is, but let's just make sure that the audience is fully aware.
I'll give you an example. I have had to fire people from my band before because they have made comments about the things that I'm wearing. I spilled something on my dress, and a member of my band looked at me and said, "Oh, you call that a dress, huh?" Stuff like that.
Wow.
Another example is people brushing up against me in a sexually aggressive way to try to show dominance when I'm dressed in a particular type of way. Somebody looking from the outside in might see just somebody bumping into me. I see them bearing down on me and the look on their face. I catch their vibe, and I understand that they're very purposely brushing up against my breasts. They're very purposely brushing up against the front of my body as a way to show dominance and show me that I'm not powerful, they are. Those are the types of microaggressions that I've been dealing with.
My whole body just tightened up when you said, like, it's just, that sounds so terrifying. And I understand that that's not something that, like, I experience. And, like, hearing that, it's just like, it's awful.
The reason I wanted to go into it is because microaggressions obviously can mean different things for different people, but they're not micro at all, especially for the person who's dealing with them. They're fucking gross. And they're super intrusive, and they feel really big, but they might look really small to someone like an outsider who doesn't really understand the dynamic of what's happening, as you were explaining, Ruby.
Yeah, it's easy for like a cis white male. I'm just using that as an example.
It's okay.
Right?
We beat up on Rich all the time. It's kind of like the thing.
But, you
That's
know,
fine.
in a broader sense, it's easy for a bystander who doesn't know what to look for to see that type of interaction and not have a red flag raised. Because they're just seeing somebody brush up against me, but I'm experiencing it, and I'm, you know, taking in the vibe. You know, even some of these little comments that people make, right? It's like, it's subtle, but it could be easy for somebody else to just kind of not hear or sort of blow off. But for me, I'm taking it in, and after repeated patterns of these types of microaggressions, every single time I'm, you know, you become a little bit like hypervigilant, and you grab onto that energy, and you become very sensitive to it over time, because you start to recognize and understand what that energy looks like and how it presents.
I want to go back to something you said a minute ago about bringing up younger artists and sort of like acting as a mentor. That's something that I think we hear a lot, especially from people who have been involved in the music scene for a long time, that they kind of want to be the person that they didn't have when they were coming up. Like, nobody warned them about who to look out for. Record labels, bookers, sound engineers. There's no how to be a musician college course. So it's sort of up to the people who've been around before them to kind of do that. And I think it's great that you're one of those people who are helping out the next generation of upcoming musicians in that way.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really passionate about it because, like you said, I didn't have anybody that was helping me. And I ended up in certain situations that were incredibly horrifying and traumatic because of my status as a woman in the music industry. And honestly, because of my status as a woman in the music industry who is aware of the patterns of harm and abuse and who's willing to call it out. Because women who do the best in these types of environments are the ones who stay quiet, the ones who take the abuse on the chin and refuse to speak up about it. When you start getting loud, people start getting mad. Even if what you're saying is true, because then what ends up happening is you have people who try to discredit you by spreading lies about you, flaming you, telling people things that aren't true to try to discredit, you know, your reputation and, you know, your credibility as a narrator. And so, like, I just feel so strongly that solidarity is the antidote to that type of energy. And the more people that are aware of what those cycles of harm look like towards women, the more people that are aware of that and that can stand up against it, the better. And we might as well be banding together as women and femmes and non-binaries in the music scene and people of color in the music scene to stand up against the white supremacist patriarchal culture that continues to put cis white men at the forefront of the scene.
Can you dive a little bit into some of the experiences, the negative experiences that you've had that have gotten you to this point of wanting to teach and protect others?
Yeah, in 2018, I was in a relationship with a guy who ran a stage at a festival in southern Minnesota. It was a smaller side stage, but my band had been booked there. You know, him and his crew ran that stage and they all hung out there. And a friend of ours was actually was killed. And I was aware that there was an abusive relationship going on between her and her partner. And I started asking a lot of questions. And the more questions that I asked, the more stories changed first the story was, oh, they were in a fight and she followed him across the street and got hit by a car. And then the story was, oh, actually she threw herself in front of the car and killed herself because she's crazy. And then the other story that came out eventually was somebody coming forward and saying, we actually saw her boyfriend push her. And then, I was called maybe a year or two ago from somebody who said that they had insider information about what happened. And I was told that she was killed as a part of a sex trafficking ring. So I don't really know what happened. These are all things that I was told. I don't really know what the truth is. I know that the police department had classified it as a homicide. And I started to talk to people. I started to ask questions, and I was asked to share about my experiences in a confidential, quote unquote, advocacy group for women. So I first shared about, hey, I dated this guy and he was psychologically and physically abusive to me. That was maybe about a paragraph. And then the other 8 or 9 paragraphs were talking about my concerns about the death of my friend and how I was incredibly upset about the lack of justice and the lack of transparency and accountability around her death. And that is when I started to become flamed and harassed by the people in the community that I was essentially trying to figure out what this harm was coming from. So instead of people banding together to try to find justice for this woman who was killed, everybody said that I was crazy. Everybody said that I had so much trauma that I didn't know right from left. I was flamed with a 5,000-word Facebook post by my ex at the time, which actually resulted in me getting a restraining order granted against him because he was telling people not to support my career. And so there were a lot of people who read and saw that and didn't have a context. And suddenly I became kind of exiled and isolated from that scene. And I had to go off then and just build my own thing. And it hasn't been until recently I've been able to go back and sort of start to engage again with some of those people and start talking about this experience. And in the meantime, we have a mother of 3 boys who was killed under very suspicious circumstances that has never had any justice, and nobody ever stopped to talk about how to find justice for that. The focus was on me speaking out and how I'm crazy and how I should never talk about these things because I'm being dramatic, I'm being ridiculous, all that. And so as a woman, I think those types of experiences really shatter your reality and they shatter your trust and faith in humanity. And it's scary because around that murder were also a lot of allegations of women getting drugged and raped. I had a friend that came to a show of mine, and the same person that I suspected had killed my other friend came to one of my shows before I understood what was happening, obviously. This is very recently after she was killed, and went on a date with a friend of mine, drugged her, and attempted to carry her back to his house when she was limp. And some friends of hers intercepted her on the beach, and he wouldn't give them to her. So they had to follow this guy with my limp, drugged friend to his apartment and wrest her away from him. And it was so obvious that this guy was incredibly harmful because there's all these stories about him drugging women. He did that to my friend. His other girlfriend ended up dead under very suspicious circumstances. There was another woman that had come forward who experienced direct harm almost immediately after the death of his other partner. I find it quite odd that somebody would lose their partner in a tragic accident and then immediately start up a relationship with someone else and then immediately have that person start talking about how they're experiencing violence as well. It's very suspicious. And so these are all the questions that I was asking, and they were never addressed. I was dismissed and gaslit. And it was really painful. And, it definitely affected my ability to have opportunities because there were people that believed the things that these people that were trying to discredit me said about it. I've learned that you move forward. You move forward and you build community. And if you're a good person, your character shines through. And in the end, the truth always comes to light. The things that are done in darkness come to light eventually. I'm still waiting for that justice for my friend, though.
I was going to ask, because you said you're only now able to kind of return back to some of the social circle from 2018, and you're kind of checking in on that after all of this time. Is there anyone that you've spoken to that is now more understanding of what you were saying the entirety of this time, that maybe they've seen something or they come to kind of a better understanding of the situation?
Yeah, some of them have. There are still people in that scene who believe, the kind of smear campaign, and that's really hurtful to run into those people. And I've just tried to explain it to them, and whether they believe me or not is their choice. But there are some people, though, yeah, absolutely, who have really come around. I had some advocates early on who were involved in that scene that were interested in safe spaces, because different people, different kind of philosophies. And so I had a friend of mine actually reach out and say, hey, like, this seems super sus. Like, are you okay? You know, and that was cool because some people saw it for what it was. Moving forward, I think that, yeah, there's been some understanding about it, but I just have to be honest and say, like, it's actually never been resolved because people don't talk about it. It's been completely swept under the rug. So people aren't actually having conversations with me about this. Some of them have just decided that they'll tolerate sharing space with me now.
If someone is talking about, like, let's say there's rumors going around, this person might have killed someone. This person is consistently violent. In another scene, someone is known as a serial abuser or a rapist or someone who consistently goes after younger girls. Why is it just easier or better for them to just kind of turn the other cheek and move forward?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I've spent a lot of time wondering about that. I think it's multifaceted. Number one, I think that people don't want to entertain the idea that somebody that they know and love is capable of something like that. It's a lot to process. It's a lot to process that the friend that you know and love is actually somebody who's capable of taking someone's life or capable of taking somebody's consent, right? I think it's really easier to bury your head in the sand and say, hey, I'm actually not going to believe that because I love this person. I don't want to rupture my relationship with them. So I think that's number one. But I think number two is the prevalence of patriarchal conditioning in our society, where it is very normalized and accepted to call women crazy. It's very normalized and accepted to say, like, oh, her, yeah, she's crazy. Like, don't listen to her. People don't really do that with men. When men speak out, it's often taken a lot more seriously. Whereas when women speak out, it's quite easy to spin something about how nuts she is and how she's just crazy and just dismiss her and not take her seriously. So women are often not taken seriously when we speak up. I think that women are just often not taken seriously. I mean, I think that is a sentence that is applicable across the board to many different issues. And we're not taken seriously when we talk about abuse. We're not, you know, a lot of times it's, oh, she's saying it for attention. She wants attention. Or the other one is, she's saying it because she's trying to destroy him or whatever. Like, she's jealous. He's like not in love with her. So she's trying to like destroy him out of revenge, you know, like, and it's like any healthy relationship I've ever had. Like, I haven't really felt the desire to tell people like, oh yeah, he broke up with me. He's such a jerk. Like, I have felt the desire to tell people like, hey, this guy sexually assaulted me while we were dating. I just want you to know. Even the desire to speak out around a relationship is just a red flag that someone was abused in and of itself. I know we have all sorts of different personalities. I'm not trying to make a general blanket statement, but women are not coming forward with these stories for attention or for revenge. We're coming forward with these stories because we want justice and we want to have safe scenes and safe spaces.
This reminds me of this. Remember, like 6 or so months ago, maybe longer, when they were talking about like which one did you feel safer with in the woods, the bear or a man? And everyone's like, bear, hard stop, bear, period. And like one of the comments that had resonated with so many people was that a woman said, if I went up to someone and I said a bear attacked me, they would believe me. And I think that kind of harkens back to what you're saying, like, and it's really shocking when you put it in those terms where like, if you walk up to someone and you're like, a bear attacked me, they're like, fuck, are you okay? And if you walk up to someone and you say, a man attacked me, they're like, you sure about that? What were you wearing? Like, why? Why are there follow-up questions? Who's trying to destroy the bear? Why don't you ask about the bear's reputation?
It's such a double standard, and it's the way that abuse has continued to be allowed to thrive. It's the culture of silence that has been created by this gaslighting, by this, well, what were you wearing? Are you sure it's not your fault? And when we have the onus of sexual violence placed on women, then men are allowed to indiscriminately sexually abuse without accountability, which is what the patriarchy wants, because the patriarchy wants women to be oppressed and men to be in power. And I've said this many times, and I'm going to say it again. This is something that Bell Hooks talks about in her writings a lot. The patriarchy harms men just as much as it harms women, because it asks men to commit acts of emotional self-mutilation in order to be the superior gender. It's asking men to set aside their emotions, set aside their compassion in order to commit harm or dismiss women. It's also holding men to a standard of masculinity that's toxic. Anybody who's ever shamed any man for his size, that is an arm of patriarchal violence against males.
I remember being young and being like, it's small, ha 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 ha. Like, I didn't even know what that was. I was 8. What is small? What is supposed to be small? I don't know, but I'm going to say it because that makes me cool, question mark.
Yeah, it's normalized. It's part of the culture. And when you go back and start to pull apart some of this, you start to understand that this culture of patriarchy and oppression, it is oppressing all of us. It is not healthy. And even though men directly benefit from this power dynamic, they really don't.
I mean, no one benefits from a giant lifted truck with like 15 exhaust pipes out the back and flames on the side. So I get it.
The men that I'm talking to aren't having fulfilling relationships with women. You know, they're not feeling fulfilled in their hearts. They're spiraling into addiction. They're spiraling into sex addiction. They're spiraling into, you know, SI or self-abusive behaviors because they are not able to be emotionally whole because of the way that they've been conditioned by patriarchal society.
It's an unattainable standard.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So, I mean, it's for the men as much as it is for the women and for the non-binary friends and for the people of color, because anybody who's studied this stuff understands that once you start to pull back the layers of patriarchal society, you also start to pull back white supremacy.
And when you have this kind of machismo, male bullshit, patriarchy, and you see people in music, in punk, that are like completely co-signing onto this idea of like what a man is supposed to be like, it's very confusing. Because one of the things that has consistently, and I think I've talked about it like every episode for the past 2 years, let me down about punk is how much everyone in that genre actually conforms to bullshit and how like easily they are able to be molded into a structure that is not any different than what common culture is doing. They just threw a bunch of plaid spikes on it and it looks like shit. There's no reason that the people who are supposedly the free thinkers, the ones who are more out there, the ones who are listening to the antithesis of, should be aligning themselves with this basic ass masculine patriarchal bullshit. And if someone's going to start this kind of pseudo revolution, I would hope to see it in like the counterculture, but I'm not seeing it.
Isn't that what the counterculture is for? To dismantle,
I would think so.
These harmful, you know, harmful structures, societal structures that we have. And so, yeah, when you see people who are punk or like hippie and they're trying to like be counterculture, but then they are facing the very things about the dominant culture that are toxic, you kind of sit there and go, well, what's even the point? The whole point of counterculture is to, you know, remove the toxicity from the larger culture. Music is, there's a quote and I'm having a hard time finding the exact words, but, you know, music is a like purveyor of culture, essentially. So like, when we create music in a counterculture and it becomes popular, that music then becomes pushed into the dominant culture. And then a little bit of that counterculture gets pushed into the dominant culture. We saw that in the 1960s. And we saw a lot of progress being made for, you know, American Indian rights, women's rights, civil rights, all of these things. I think in large part because of the strong counterculture that was created in the music industry around this and the way that that music was able to be pushed to the forefront and then, you know, influence a larger culture, because there's ideas that people don't want to accept through talking or through writing that they will absolutely accept through music because it touches the soul.
It's like a trickle up effect from like the underground up into the common culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And we as artists need to be intentional about what we're embracing and taking away from the dominant culture in order to heal the dominant culture. And I truly believe that that is, I mean, I don't want to, I guess, put it on anybody else. I believe that that's my job as an artist. And that's why I continue to wake up every day and do what I do, even when it's hard, even when it's traumatic, even when it, you know, feels really challenging. I continue to do it because I feel like there's a huge opportunity for healing and growth when we look at music as a tool for that.
Last night, I watched the Yacht Rock documentary that's on HBO Max. And it was interesting because it was this genre of music that was like extremely popular. It was the most popular genre of music at the time. And it was these like slow, soft rock songs, mostly sung by guys about love and their feelings and emotions. And they weren't particularly good looking and they kind of dressed like nerds, but everybody loved it. And they were huge stars because they were singing about stuff that everyone could actually relate to. And it was coming out of the, you know, cock rock, Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, AC/DC sort of era of hypermasculinity. And then it was like, well, we're just going to like throw our feelings out there backed by like smooth jazz and R&B music, which, you know, coming out of the black culture. So it was just it was just interesting how that, you know, we've kind of gone now back to that whole like cock rock, like hyper masculine type thing. And there was a short period of time where we're kind of on the right path in like music, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think music being a tool for men and anybody, I mean, but I say men because men are not socially conditioned to pay attention to their internal world or their emotions. They're conditioned to suppress it because they're told that it's not masculine to have certain emotions. When men are able to tap into their feelings by writing music, that's incredibly healing for patriarchal oppression too. And I love that you brought that up.
This is a question that comes up a lot in our conversations. When someone causes harm, is there a way back? People who are fans of someone who will get called out or accused of something will immediately scream cancel culture. And like you brought up before, trying to ruin this person's life and like throw them away, which we all know is not the case. Like no one is trying to do this. But the question does remain, is there a way to come back from something like that and become reintegrated into a culture or a music scene or a community?
Yeah, I do, because I feel like in a lot of ways, this conversation is the light out of the darkness, because we experience this a lot in the music scene, especially since the Me Too movement came to a head, where somebody is named as having caused harm. And it's almost like as soon as they're named or as soon as they're called out, immediately everybody's like, oh my God, they're going to get canceled. Oh my God, they're going to get canceled. And then you have people like what I experienced trying to discredit the person speaking out because there's not a belief in a repair or an accountability process. It's sort of an undercurrent of beliefs around as soon as this person's named as an abuser, their entire career is ruined. So let's go ahead and just discredit the person that said that so that this person doesn't have a death sentence, right? And so that type of sentiment underpinning a lot of these conversations creates an incredibly unsafe environment, both for the people coming forward with these stories, but it also creates an unsafe environment for the person who committed harm. Because instead of us looking at it and going, okay, what happened here and how can we move forward? Is there a way forward? The focus becomes on the person who spoke out and how they shouldn't have spoken out or how they're crazy or whatever. So I shared earlier a pretty extreme story that I experienced dating somebody in the music scene who caused me harm and their reaction to being called out and how that culminated in a $10,000 restraining order case that, I had ended up needing to pursue to protect my own self and my own interests. On the flip side of that, I dated somebody else in the music scene who caused me harm, and he was already in therapy working on some of these issues. So I went into the relationship having an understanding that this person did have some things that they were working on, number one. But I also knew that they were in therapy. But I mean, it was, I don't need to go into details, but it was essentially psychological harm and it was physical assault, that, non-consensual physical assault in the realm of, intimacy and all that. And so what ended up happening was I sat with it for a while and I ended up actually calling this person and just being like, hey, I'm really upset and I feel like there was harm that happened here. And I just want to have a conversation with you about it because I want to talk to you before I talk to anybody else about it. And they did a few things that I'm going to go ahead and put forth as things that people can look for in green flags when they are working with somebody who's committed harm to see if there is a possibility for repair. Number one, there's a spectrum of violence. I was date raped not that long ago. And that is not a situation that I personally would consider something I would want to repair, because the amount of violence that I experienced in that instant is beyond my ability to seek repair. I do not desire repair with that person. However, this other person was like a close friend of mine, and obviously we were dating, so also my partner. And we'd been having ongoing conversations about harm and how it shows up. And so when I brought up to him, the one that was in therapy, like, hey, there was this instance of non-consensual force essentially used. And then there was also this instance of psychological violence that had happened in terms of like gaslighting, manipulation, deception, stuff like that. When I brought those things up, a couple things that he did that really were helpful was, number one, he took full accountability. He was like, yes, I did those things and I feel awful about it. And I really want to do whatever I can. So number one, there's no disagreement between the two of us about what happened. Okay. I told him he did it. He agreed that he did it. We agree on reality. Number one condition for repairing harm. Everybody agrees on what happened. Okay. Number two, accountability. not only does the person agree that what happened was wrong, they also agree that they need to be accountable for it, and they agree that they should not be engaging like that again. Number 3, the third thing I think that people should really look for is this person is not diminishing the harm that they caused. And I have been it's been about a year and a half. I've been actively working with this partner. Like, we were probably hopping on the line once a week, once a month, depending on, how things are going, and just checking in about this stuff. And it was really, sometimes it was messy. Sometimes it was like me being like, I'm so mad at you, I don't want to talk to you. But one of the conversations that we ended up having was him pretty much saying, like, he called me up and he's like, look, I used force with you because I have a problem with being a misogynist. He said, some men are misogynists and they keep it inside. I am a misogynist and I have an impulse control issue as well. So because of my misogynistic thoughts and my impulse control issue, I used force in you in a way that was non-consensual, and I'm sorry. At first, hearing that, I was actually mad at him, and I didn't talk to him for like a month because I was like, you're a misogynist. You admitted it. I'm so mad at you. You know what I mean? But honestly, the fact that he admitted that and then went to therapy about it, like, I sat with it and I was like, you know what? This is how we repair, is people literally saying, it's like an addict. You're like, I have a problem. This is the nature of my problem. It's an issue. I need to work on it. I take full accountability for it, and I do not diminish the harm. I also actually called up a leadership committee he still is on this leadership committee. He was not removed from the committee after I made this call, which I like and which I want because this person's been accountable. But I ended up calling him out much in the same way that I called out, my other ex, telling people outside of the situation, hey, this harm happened. And I said to them, I'm not trying to like tell you guys what to do, but I want there to be transparency around this because this happened. I need to be seen and heard. If you guys are going to be elevating this person into a position of leadership, we need to be making sure there's not active harm happening and that this person is actively working on this. And it was agreed. Everybody agreed that it was appropriate that we would approach him, and that, I was freaking out because he and I weren't talking at the time. And then I did this thing, and it was crazy because I called him up. I felt really bad about it. I was like, oh my God, like, I'm such a jerk. I went behind his back. And I called him up and I pretty much told him how I was feeling about it. I was like, I'm, trying to heal, and I'm really mad that you're in this leadership position, but I also see all the accountability work that you're doing. And I just feel bad I went behind your back, but I also felt like I needed to. And his response was like really, really awesome because it totally solidified in my mind why I chose to do a repair and accountability process with him. Because he said to me, he was like, you know what? I'm not even mad at you because this is something that has created a lot of really important and vulnerable conversations with me and my friends that I'm doing this organizing work with. He's like, and I actually did want to tell them about the harm that I've had a history of committing and I didn't know how. So you bringing this up was actually really helpful, and thank you.
That's so great on so many levels. I mean, just first and foremost, I don't even know if I would like talk to an ex again after we broke up most of the time. But he was able to keep your trust throughout the entire process. And I'm assuming there were results, which is part of the reason why you were able to continue to engage in these conversations and see actual results and see that he was trying to take accountability and, make himself into the person that he was hoping to be.
Yeah, these were safe conversations because a lot of times when we're engaging with narcissists or abusers, we end up experiencing gaslighting. We end up experiencing minimization, blame shifting, deflection. He is quite well versed in all of those manipulation tactics and was incredibly intentional in our conversations to avoid using those tactics. Okay. And that is, I think, one of the underpinnings as well of repair with somebody who has an abusive personality or has a tendency to abuse. Or is the conversation safe to have? I'm not going to go back for a year and a half and talk to somebody that's gaslighting me about the situation. I'm not going to do that. I am going to go back, though, and talk to somebody who's actually being a safe person to talk to. And I actually had an opposite experience in that same situation where I had tried to kind of close the door on them, and my brain started like splitting and being like, oh, they're so bad. They're such a bad person. And I ended up actually getting in a pretty dark headspace with that type of thinking. And it was really helpful. It was after I said that I stopped talking to them and they admitted to being a misogynist, and I was mad and I didn't want to talk to them for a while. And I think I had a therapist at the time too that was like, why are you talking to this guy? Like, don't talk to him. You know what I mean? But because of that kind of black and white thinking and that kind of splitting, I ended up kind of creating a scenario in my head that was very dark and dismal. And it wasn't until I got in a really dark place and I ended up calling him up and being like, I do actually think we need to have an open communication again. And I think this is why. And it was actually talking to him and hearing him reflect and hearing him just be really open and understanding about, me going behind his back and like telling his leadership team that he was on, like what had happened. It was hearing him be open about that and being appreciative to me for holding him accountable that I think was like the final stage of healing for us. But in order for people to heal after they've committed harm, they have to be committed to having safe conversations. And the other thing that he did was he was always available to talk to me about it. He didn't block me. He didn't say, you know what, I don't want to talk to you about this. He didn't. He was like, every time I reached out, he's like, okay, you know, I'm busy now. Let's hop on the line on Tuesday at 8 o'clock and try to hash this out. You know what I mean? So even if he wasn't available right then and there, which is fine, we all have lives, he was able to come back and say, okay, I can't talk tonight. I can talk to you in 2 days. Can we talk about this then? Yes. Okay, good. And so like having that person not only be safe to talk to, but available to talk to also really helps.
I think one of the issues with why there's not more of this happening is the level of maturity that this person exhibited is almost unheard of by a man in the music industry.
I know. It's actually like been kind of mind-blowing for me. Like the way that my other ex reacted to me calling him out to people that he knew, and like he flamed me, like I had to get a restraining order, and like having that be compared to the way that this person reacted to me is actually just honestly really, really healing for me to be able to have this like type of repair process. I mean, the whole point of it was to heal. And I gotta say, it's so much easier to heal from harm when the person that harmed you admits what they did is wrong and they show care and compassion towards you. Part of the hard part about harm is feeling abandoned. So when the person doesn't abandon you in the midst of that repair, it's incredibly healing.
Since the beginning of the podcast, when the first few episodes came out, it didn't even seem like accountability was an option. But over time, you know, we have talked to more and more people, and we've heard more and more stories of people actually taking accountability. And while it may not result in everything that happened with you in this situation, where you were able to stay in contact with the person and watch them take accountability and really give you that, you know, kind of nod of, yes, I did that, which was able to kind of spur your healing process. Just anyone who doesn't instantaneously shout you're a liar in some way is helping the survivor or victim. I mean, just listening to what they're saying and having someone not just instantaneously swat them down, because so much, as we had talked about earlier, the knee-jerk reaction so much of the time is, are you sure? Or that's not what happened. And it's cultural.
Yeah. We're taught that women are unreliable narrators.
Right.
Yeah.
And that no one would ever hurt anyone ever.
Yeah, ever. That would never happen. Why would that happen? Why would somebody do that? Well, there's a lot of reasons, actually.
But he's so nice to me, so, you know, he couldn't possibly have... I met this famous person one time, like he shook my hand, so he couldn't possibly be a monster.
Accountability can go so far for so many people. The person who is the one who is stating that they were harmed, the person that has been accused of doing the harm, I mean, it's really beneficial on a number of levels. You can learn from your mistakes. And we've all made mistakes. That's the other thing, is that assuming that someone's popping out of the womb at 100% and not going to fuck up.
Yeah, we all make human mistakes. And the part of the human journey is evolution and growth. And when we have relationships with people, that is one of the greatest catalysts for that evolution and growth. So when we deny people who have the ability to change and grow, the opportunity to change and grow, I believe that we ourselves are committing harm. When you just exile somebody without giving them the proper chance, it's harmful and abusive to live in a society with such a punitive system of justice. And when we recreate that in our, you know, in our music scene and in our communities, you know, we don't have to act like cops to each other. You know what I mean? There's a way out of the darkness, and there's a way into the light and out of the darkness that doesn't have to entail this black and white, incredibly unhealthy splitting of good and bad. If we can hold space for the nuance and the gray area, maybe we can find that we can make some progress towards healing this culture instead of just putting the onus on the individual and exiling them, right? Because then it becomes more unsafe for survivors to speak out. It becomes more unsafe in our communities because there's people that, instead of working through their problems, being held by the community and being cared for and held accountable by the community, they are leaving and going to new communities and continuing this patterns of harm.
It's very similar to priests being moved to different parishes when they abuse children.
Yeah, real convenient just to get them out of there. You don't deal with it, but someone else does. Why don't we just repair it from the root?
So one of the things that we see a lot when people are called out for abuse or assault, harassment, whatever it is, one of the excuses they'll give is, of course, I didn't do it. As we talked about earlier, you're crazy, you're being difficult, you're whatever, making shit up. Or the oh so popular, I was wasted, drunk, high on drugs, alcohol, etc. That's not who I really am when I'm sober. Let's talk a little bit about that, because that's also something else that you have sort of done a lot of research on, work on, and it's something that people hear a lot, but they don't really know too much about.
Yeah, let's talk about it. I was in a relationship with a man when I was 20 years old. He was 5 years older than me, who was an IV drug user, and he was incredibly in active addiction. I was also in active addiction at the time, so it made a lot of sense that I would be dating a guy like that. I don't know. I just gotten out of a relationship where we also were both in active addiction and then just skipped right on over into another one. But this one was obviously much more extreme with the substances being used, and it ended up being an incredibly scary experience. And he was abusive, and I ended up getting back together with him like so stupidly, like 8 years later, because he was sober. And I was like, oh, well, he only did those things because he was on drugs. Now that he's sober, he doesn't have those problems. What I actually found out the hard way was this guy had those problems even worse when he was sober, because the alcohol and the drugs medicated the problems. And he ended up beating me up and raping me at the end of our relationship. And that is when I really had this moment of realization, like, substances do not cause this type of problem. But these types of stories, I think that they just reiterate, like, these are psychological power and control problems that these men have. This is not because of drugs and alcohol. In fact, the drugs and alcohol are probably making the abuse problem a little bit better because they are medicating the aggressive, violent urges. These are men who want power and control, and they have been taught by society that they deserve it and that they're entitled to it. And so they will do whatever it takes to maintain that power and control, right? And substances, maybe it numbs the violent urge, maybe it lowers the inhibition to amplify the violent urge. But the drugs and alcohol are not what causes it. It is totally in the person already.
And also the power that they're seeking is not from one source. It's not, it's like if they get belittled when they're at their job, they've lost. Therefore, they need to gain back in some other aspect of their life. So they turn around and they beat the shit out of their partner. I mean, it doesn't have to be lost at work, gain at work. It's something to fill the void of what has been lost.
Yeah, it's all about power and control. And like, even talking with, my ex-partner who I've done this accountability thing with, I said to him just fairly recently, I was like, next time you're doing therapy about this, I want you to consider that, maybe you use some of these tactics, these abuse tactics, when you're losing control of a situation. And he was like, oh my God, I never thought about that. And I was like, yeah. I was like, go explore that, because I think that that's part of when I saw this stuff coming up the most. And I think that people often, men especially, who are, not socially conditioned to be aware of their own emotions, they will do these things almost subconsciously. They will do these things like without fully understanding what's driving them, because they're not aware of their internal world as much as they need to be. And so part of healing for somebody like that is becoming aware of the internal world. What type of insecurities am I masking? What am I trying to take control of? What do I feel entitled to be in control of that I am not actually entitled to be in control of? And how do I remedy that distortion so that I'm not violent?
We all kind of run in, or used to, in these sort of scenes where drug use and drinking is not only like prevalent, but kind of celebrated. It's like, just something you do, something you're supposed to do. Like, we're counterculture, like we get fucked up.
Yeah. And I mean, the normalization of, consent barriers being broken down with substances is another thing that I am passionate about talking about, because it's something that I've experienced on multiple levels. And many women, many men also have experienced this on multiple levels. And there's a normalization of intoxication, right? Like intoxicated sex. There's a normalization of, okay, we're going to go on a date, we're going to have a few drinks, and we're going to hook up. In and of itself, that's not necessarily problematic, but when it becomes problematic is when you have drugs and alcohol being consumed to the level that a person is no longer able to consent, and then those liberties are taken anyway, and then we get into the realm of sexual assault.
You just described like mine and a lot of people's like early 20s. That's something that's being brought up a lot more now, especially with younger generations, is they won't have any sort of sexual contact if drugs or alcohol have been consumed because you can't consent, which is great. Yeah.
Wholesome. Oh my God. This is what the younger people are doing. Are you serious?
Yeah.
I'm so proud. Oh.
As someone in their mid 40s is,
yeah,
one part of me is like, that is wild that that's how they are. But on the other hand, I'm like, that's great because that's how it should have been the entire time. But we kind of came up in this world of like, it's cool and sexy to drink and do drugs, and that's just what you do. And it really didn't do any of us any favors.
No, it didn't, and it hasn't, even though we like to think it has. Sometimes it has not. Well, there is a certain sexiness to getting kind of loose with somebody and lowering your inhibitions and having a couple drinks and, oh, I was kind of nervous to kind of touch you or be near you, but now that I've had a couple drinks, like I'm feeling better about it. That's not inherently a violation of consent. You know, I don't believe so. A couple years ago, I was sexually assaulted in this kind of particular way, and I suppressed it for a long time. And I ended up having a conversation with a friend of mine where I like told him about it. I was like, yeah, dude, I had this weird experience and like I don't remember any of it. And he was like, oh my God. He's like, what? He's like, dude, you never told me about that. Like, that's a huge deal. And I was like, yeah, I guess you're right. You know, like I just didn't want to process it because it's like a lot of work to process something like that. And I have processed it now and it was a lot of work. But something that he and I talked about, he grew up with his dad as a cop. And he was like, dude, I always knew that you're not supposed to have sex with drunk girls because there was a lot of cases that my dad worked on where men were convicted of rape because they had sex with an incapacitated woman. And so he was like, you know, like I'm fully aware of the consent issues there. And I don't know if this was like in the 90s. This was a hot topic at some point, but somebody on college campuses, there was all these problems around consent and intoxication in college campuses and fraternities. And the idea was floated. And I love this idea, actually. I really do, of like a consent form being signed before substances or alcohol is taken. So like you literally sit down with that person sober before you guys start doing anything, you know, like drinking or doing anything, you know, wild together. And you sit down and go, are we going to have sex tonight? Yes or no? Decide it sober. And when I look back to the situation where I was date raped a couple years ago, if this man, I did not go into that date planning to have sex with him that night. And if we would have sat down ahead of that date and done that, I would have checked the no box. I'm not having sex with you tonight. I'm trying to get to know you tonight. And instead, I woke up in the morning, like with my period blood in 5 different rooms of this guy's house. And he'd pretty much toss me around like a fucking rag doll when I was wasted. And that's sexual violence. But when I told, like, I had a best friend who claimed to be like this huge feminist advocate, I told her that story. She completely dismissed it. And she pretty much told me it was my fault because I was, you know, consuming substances, and just dismissed it and said, oh, he's immature. And, you know, and the same with my partner who I'm doing the accountability process with right now. I was partnered with him at the time. I told him the same story. We were actually in a polyamorous relationship. So we were in an open relationship when this has happened. So I said, hey, I had this encounter last night that was like really messed up or whatever. And his response was, oh, you should talk to my other partner about how you can prevent that from happening in the future. That's actually been another facet of our repair process, and we have repaired that. But it's like we dug into a lot of conversations about why was that your de facto response when I'm literally telling you that I don't remember a sexual encounter I had. For people who are supporting friends that are in the dating scene, if somebody comes to you and says, I had a sexual encounter and I don't remember any of it, that is a huge red flag. Nobody should be having sex with anybody that's incapacitated or blacked out.
We can go back to the bear metaphor. You get mauled by a bear, you go tell your friends, hey, I got attacked by a bear, and their first response is, well, we can sit down and talk about how we can make sure that you don't ever get attacked by a bear again. Not, are you okay? Or holy shit, you got attacked by a bear. It's, let's prevent this from happening to you because you obviously did something to provoke a bear attack. Years ago, when the podcast started, we had a conversation about consent and how different it is because I'm slightly younger than Rich, but neither of our generations really talked about it. It was just kind of like, hey, if you're there, then it means you're good to go. And like, that's kind of what everyone just assumed. And when we were having our conversation about consent and talking about what the newer generations are doing and how they're much more verbal, like you said, in advance or even in the moment, one of the first things that I thought about was like, oh, this is gonna like really like ruin everything. Like, we'd be so weird to be like on a date and be like, so we're one drink in, I'm still sober, you're kind of good looking, got about 2 more hours until you want to like, yes or no? Like, for me, I'd be like, ew, gross. Like, that's so like planned out and not like spur of the moment. But the more like we've had conversations with people, the more I've thought about it. It's so much more beneficial to know you're going on a date where you have to possibly plan something out, yes or no, and then feel like you're going to be safe for the rest of the evening. Instead of being like, what will happen? Where will I wake up? Is there going to be a problem here? And then will I have to deal with it for months to years afterwards?
Yeah, consent is so sexy. Consent is sexy. Like, end of story. Like, we think it's all stuffy, it's so weird. But honestly, if I'm going on a date, I've probably already decided before that date whether I'm willing to have sex with that person or not. And you could ask me and I will say yes or no. And as much as it's like, oh, it seems like, you know, not fun to ask, you know, even when you're in the moment with somebody, like even just saying, is this okay? For me, as a trauma survivor, I think that's super sexy. But there's kind of this pushback, like you said, of people thinking like, oh, it's too stuffy, it's too weird. Then let's normalize it. We've normalized rape culture. Let's normalize consent culture. It's not weird if you do it all the time and if that's the norm. It's just weird if you're used to being raped. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
It's true. Like, it's true.
I mean, it is true.
Sexual violence, consent feels weird.
Right. And it's like we were talking about with so much of what we talked about already this evening, it's so much of the culture. It's just what we're used to. We can shift what we're used to and we can change the culture. We just haven't done so. And we're consistently co-signing cultures that are harming people instead of doing things which are keeping people safe and uplifting us.
Yeah, it's up to us what we tolerate and it's up to us what we build.
One of the things that you do that I think is so awesome is you're a music teacher for younger kids. And these are the kids who are going to be the next generation of musicians, part of music communities, part of music scenes. Can you talk a little bit about how you started doing that, how fulfilling you find it? Talk about what it's like to be an adult musician and then see people at the very beginning of their musical journey.
Yeah, I love that question. The reason why I'm a music teacher is actually because of an experience of sexual assault I had as a teenager. I was brutally sexually assaulted at 14. I was actually gang raped and left for dead by these people. And then I had some friends come and intercept me right before these guys were going to drop me in the ditch, is pretty much what happened. And around that experience as a 14-year-old, I experienced extreme trauma symptoms after that. I was falling asleep in class. My academics dipped. My parents didn't really understand what happened. They didn't really know what to do with it. So I didn't get really the support that I needed at the time. Everybody was super confused. I was confused. It was just a total mess. And all of the teachers at that school heard about it and they told me that I was a slut. I was told by my middle school teachers that I was a slut, and I was brought down and sat down and they all laughed at me about what happened. And the only teacher that was nice to me was the music teacher. It was the music teacher. And so I found my only safe space was in that music room and with that music teacher. I don't even think he knows. I don't think he understands like how important this was to me. So because of that experience, I just fell into music. That was my life raft. And that has continued to be my life raft all these years later.
That's so huge. Oh my gosh.
But this is why I talk about this stuff, because it's like when we're dealing with these types of issues with adolescents, with adults, we have to be able as educators to know what the signs look like. You have to be able to know what that looks like. When you hear a story like that, you get to choose as an educator. Are you going to support that student or are you going to perpetuate more harm? So one of the reasons why I became a teacher is because of the incredibly demeaning and abusive experiences that I had around that sexual assault in middle school. And so I became a teacher, and then I really got bored teaching like reading and math. I got my master's in education. I did a lot of work in the Native community doing language work and working with kids. And I ended up quitting all of that to just teach private lessons and do music full time. But I realized that I just kind of wanted more consistency, not only with pay, but with my schedule. I was doing some substitute teaching and I got a call from a principal that she pretty much was like, hey, do you want to be a music teacher? And it was super weird because I did not have my music license. I did not apply for this job. Okay. She just called me up and she's like, do you want to be a music teacher? And you know what I said to her? I said, no, I'm teaching music part-time in a Catholic school and I'm teaching private lessons. I don't want the job. About 2 months later, I was at the Catholic school and feeling like a disparity between like my values and their values and just feeling like it wasn't the right fit for me to be there. So I ended up calling the school back and being like, I had a little girl in my private lessons that also went to that school. And I was like, hey, do you guys still need a music teacher? Because I was like, I think I'm going to go full-time music teacher. And she's like, yeah. And then she was like crying about like one of the subs and how like he was mean to her. And I was like, I'm going to come be your new music teacher. Okay. And she was like, okay. And so I did. And so I called them up and they were like whole half year as subs. And I got the job and I've been teaching music full-time K5 ever since. And it's brought me so much joy. It has given me a lifeline and to feel like I can wake up in the morning and do something joyful and happy. But it also like helps me cultivate a joy in younger kids of music. I do feel like there's a toxicity, a perfection culture, a superiority culture in music sometimes where it's like, oh, you're not good enough or, you're not technically skilled enough or whatever. With these kids, the whole goal is just to spark the joy of music. We're here having fun. What kind of music do you like? How do you it's literally reaching kids through music and creating a joyful and happy space so that they understand that there is that energy out there, that we can create any reality we want with music. We can be joyful. We can learn and be intentional and be joyful at the same time. It's not all drudgery, right? And so like just sparking the joy and having fun and helping cultivate confidence in young learners so that they feel like they not only have the skill, but also just like the level of confidence to get up on a stage is a really big deal. We do performances and stuff where I teach the kids how to be a good audience, and then kids that want to perform will perform. And, it becomes kind of like a replica of what they're going to end up doing out in the world. And I talk to them a lot, like when your friends are coming out to perform, like you're not going to be talking over them or talking to your friend or giggling about stuff, because you could really make that person's performance experience negative and they may never want to perform again. So, you're helping nurture your friends when they're performing by being a good audience. And so just having these conversations, because then when they go out to a bar on Saturday night and there's a girl with an acoustic guitar, me, playing and everybody's shouting right in front of the stage, maybe, the younger generation will go, oh, let's be kind to the performer. Let's take our conversation to the back so she can be heard, stuff like that. So just cultivating being a good audience, being a good listener, the joy of music, all of it. I love it. It's joyful. And it's something that has allowed me, I think, to move through and heal some really intense trauma just by being able to be the person that I always wanted in my school.
I wish there was audience class when we were growing up, because there's so many people our age that do not know how to act in a crowd. Yeah.
It's a skill, just like performing. Listening and taking in music is also a skill.
I get that. What is it? Secondhand embarrassment when I see like two people standing in front of the stage. Like the stage is like 6 inches taller because it's a punk show, and they're just like drunkenly having a conversation and the band's playing. And I'm just like, first of all, you're yelling at each other because now the band's playing. So if you have to yell, then like maybe stop or take it to the back until they finish. But I'm just like watching them be like, oh, please shut up. Please shut up. You're right in front of everyone and they can see you. Just be nice to the people that are like pouring out their heart on stage, please, for 5 minutes.
I yelled at someone at a Bouncing Souls show. I was standing side stage and there were 2 people talking next to me. And at one point I just turned, I was like, nobody wants to hear your fucking conversation. They want to hear the band. So shut up or go somewhere else.
You're like the guy in the movie who's like, shh,
yeah.
shh.
I was.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
On behalf of all Bouncing Souls fans.
Yes.
And normalizing that too. Like sometimes you might approach somebody and they might get really offended. But I think normalizing that in our culture, like, hey, I'm not trying to be a dick. I'm just trying to point out that, like, you're kind of ruining it for everybody. Like, can you please just kind of not do that, The more we normalize taking that feedback, too, I think the better off we are.
You were talking about that you were trying to kind of be there for the kids in the ways, like, you didn't have growing up or the people, like, in your generation didn't have.
And I think that we've heard that from a couple different people, women especially, who have said they want to be the person on stage that they wish they had been able to see when they were like a teenager watching bands for the first time.
Yeah, I think as we continue to move out of this patriarchal culture and into a culture of empowerment for women and everybody, women, non-binary friends, trans friends, people of color, as we continue to move into these spaces, I think creating models of ways that women can be in solidarity with each other, or people, non-cis men can be in solidarity with each other, and creating like these communities and these safe spaces, and sort of using that philosophy of like, I'm going to be who I needed now so that the person who needs somebody like that has that.
Enough is a podcast centering on surviving abuse, harassment, and assault in the music scene. To help get the word out, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. In 2025, we are interested in talking to teachers, authors, artists, activists, counselors, community organizers, and anyone else who is dedicated to making a positive impact in their music community and our society as a whole. If that sounds like you, please reach out to us at thisisenoughpodcast@gmail.com.